Good evening, everyone. We're letting folks trickle in here. All right. We seem to have reached a steady state here to a certain degree. I'm sure folks will pop in. Good evening. In case you're in the wrong place, this is a Transcendentalist Ramble, a journey through nature and thought. My name is Bruce Magnuson, and the photography and video in this presentation was done by me. My wife Lisa's here as a co-host, so she'll help me out with questions as we go through. And this is a Massachusetts-based presentation as far as geography goes. I do see people putting into their location in the chat. That's great. See where people are from. We're going through a bit of a nor'easter here, very appropriate in Massachusetts. Here, a little bit 30 miles from the coast, we seem to not be getting the brunt of it since I'm looking out the window and seeing the trees are not moving. But I think at the coast, that's a different story. So, but very New Englandish, high of 44 degrees, I think, today, which is a little rough for May, but such as it is in New England. So we will start off with quotes, lots of quotes. The Transcendentalists are certainly very good for a quote. We'll start off with Ralph Waldo Emerson, trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string. What is a weed? A plant whose virtues have not yet been discovered. It's one of my favorite Emerson quotes. So with that, we'll talk about the agenda we're going to have today. We'll do an introduction. We'll go through some of the major characters that are in the Transcendentalist movement. Then we'll go through the actual ramble of various locations in and around Boston and eastern central Massachusetts that are related to the Transcendentalists. And then we'll do a wrap-up. So during the webinar, I'll take some breaks and answer questions. If you do have questions, there is a Q&A box here that you can pop those questions in there. And Lisa will try and keep me honest and take breaks and address the questions as we go along. So as an introduction, what is Transcendentalism? There was a recent book by Ralph Fuller, who was actually a descendant of Margaret Fuller, one of the Transcendentalists. He wrote a book that just came out late last year called Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism. And his definition is, its primary argument is that every person is valuable and worthy of respect because every person contains a divine spark. And that once we realize that, society and community will be renovated in a way that has yet to occur. So it officially began as a movement in 1836 in Harvard Square in Cambridge. 4 gentlemen, after attending the 200th anniversary of Harvard, hard to believe 1836, Harvard was already 200 years old at that point, started as a college in 1636. And the Willard Hotel in Harvard Square, which is where the first meeting happened. I guess that hotel was no longer there. But the gentlemen involved were George Ripley or Ralph Waldo Emerson, both of we'll talk a little bit more about, Frederick Henry Hodge, and George Putnam. It was a break from Unitarianism. It was born from a debate between the New Light theologians who believed that religion should focus on an emotional experience and Old Light opponents who valued reason in their approach. So I want to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Richard Higgins, who's written a book, just came out actually last November, called Thoreau's God. And he was kind enough to kind of give me a Transcendentalism 101 during the winter. And he has some pretty good descriptions of it. It holds every person has unique powers and they should research for them and constantly unfold, guide, and nourish them. In that sense, it was self-culture. When people do that, they discover that the divine principle resides in themselves and in every human person. William Ellery Channing said, "We see God around us because God dwells within us." It says, knowledge depends on the senses. The Transcendentalists believe in intuition, our native ability to know truth on our own without external proof and independent of other views or prior revelations of the truth. Emerson said his whole teaching came down to the infinitude of the private man. Wasn't an armchair. They were very active, like pragmatism, at testing the truth of an idea by the difference it makes. Thus, the Transcendentalists were very strongly anti-slavery. They believed the inequality of women must end and that children must not be punished or trained as workers, but rather led to foster the spirit within. So we'll talk about kind of these really 3 core concepts: abolition, women's rights, and education. So the Transcendentalists we're going to meet are very core to those particular concepts. And they did believe that divine wisdom could be read directly in nature. And that's another major component. Henry David Thoreau, which we'll talk a lot about. He certainly is a proponent of that. I wouldn't say Transcendentalist is riddled with humor, but there is this relatively famous cartoon that came out. Christopher Piers Cranch was a Transcendentalist. He wrote or did this cartoon called A Transparent Eyeball around 1836 to 1838, just when Emerson had written his first essay, Nature. And this is from Nature. He says, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So he kind of took that concept of the transparent eyeball and made this cartoon of an eyeball with legs. That's probably as much as humor we can squeeze out of the Transcendentalists in the next hour, but I'll try not to make it as too dry. So I want to set some context. This is all happening in the early to mid 1800s in the United States, but it is a very, very lot of change going on in this time. This is actually a photograph of the Lowell Mills. But in 1848, you had the Seneca Falls Convention, upstate New York, which is the beginning of the women's suffragette movement here in the United States. You have in Europe, and we'll talk about this with Margaret Fuller, you have European revolutions, France, Italy, Germany, the Austrian Empire. 1848 is actually known as the year of revolutions in Europe. So we have a lot of dynamic things going on in that part of the world. We have abolition. We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Both of those play a lot into the precursor to the Civil War. Actually, I plan on doing a presentation on John Brown in the fall, so we'll get a lot more detail into the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but obviously slavery is a huge issue in the mid 19th century. And you have industrialization like this picture of Lowell shows. You have steamships, you have railroads, and you have the rise of factories. So it is a very dynamic time. And I know that I think all of us and throughout history, everybody thinks they live in the most dynamic times. Certainly, we're talking about that now with things like artificial intelligence, things along of that nature. But certainly in the mid 1800s, an awful lot of stuff is going on. A change in the world is happening very rapidly, and the Transcendentalists are really, really kind of ruminating on this. So we'll talk about some of the major characters in our story. We'll talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. So we'll start with Emerson, the Sage of Concord. So he is born in Boston in 1803, actually dies in Concord in 1882. He does graduate from Harvard in 1821. He's an essayist and a lecturer. His major works are Nature, is kind of the seminal work as far as transcendental is concerned. That's published in 1836. He has The American Scholar in 1837, and the very famous essay Self-Reliance in 1841. He does inherit money from his first wife, Ellen, who passes away from tuberculosis. We'll actually talk a little bit about that as well, since that has a large impact on the folks in this story. He has to sue to get part of his estate, and at the beginning, he does become kind of the Bank of Emerson. The reason that Concord is the place that all of these people gravitate to is because of Emerson. And Emerson is able in the early days to fund a lot of this. And so a lot of these people are coming into the town, and he's able to support them in various ways. Thoreau actually works in his house, and he helps out Bronson Alcott getting a house, and he's helping people publish. He does end up making a good living as a lecturer. He actually kind of gives up the pulpit and becomes a lecturer both here and abroad. He does have financial troubles at the end of his life, but for the most part, he is really both the spiritual and the economic engine of the Transcendentalists in the mid 1800s in Concord. So he's the benefactor of them. His house is still there today, a little bit outside Concord Center. It's open from pretty much around now until I think around Columbus Day. It is still owned by the family. And I will say it is not air conditioned. So if you do want to go, I would suggest you probably go. Actually, a day when it's 44 degrees might not be such a bad day to go there. But it is a Spartan place. Right across the street from it is the Concord Museum. And the Concord Museum is this amazing little museum, relatively speaking, right outside Concord. And a lot of the folks that we talk about, artifacts from them and other things, including the Revolutionary War, are housed in this museum. And with the Emerson House being right across the street, when the Concord Museum comes into being in the 1930s, they have a discussion with the Emerson family about a lot of the artifacts that they have, and they come to the conclusion that they're better housed, can have, better HVAC, or there's no actually AC in those days, but, better climate control, a better place to show it at the Concord Museum. And so you see in this picture here on the right-hand side, this is actually Emerson's house taken from a window in the Concord Museum. So it literally is right across the street. And they take Emerson's study and move it pretty much lock, stock, and barrel across the street. And so today, when you go to the Concord Museum, you will see Ralph Waldo Emerson's study pretty much fully put together. There's actually, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, he's buried in a plot in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord as well. And from the backyard, there's kind of this path that wanders, and it does eventually end up at Walden Pond. So you can see from this map here, if you do start at Waldo's house here and ramble through the woods, and this is all pretty much public land, you can walk to Walden Pond, and this is actually the location of where Thoreau's cabin was. This is actually the visitor center here on the other side of the road, and it's about 2.2 miles. So they would do that walk, and you can still do that walk today. Speaking of Thoreau, he is the only one who's actually born in Concord of the Transcendentalists. So he's born there in 1817 and dies in 1862 in Concord. He does graduate from Harvard as well in 1837. His major works are Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, 1849. He was actually writing that while he was at Walden Pond in the 1840s. He also has an essay on walking, and of course, Walden, his most famous book, is published in 1854. During his lifetime, he does not sell a lot of books. One of the jokes is, I believe the publication run for the Week on the Concord and Merrimack River is around 1,000 volumes. He ends up getting about 700 back. And so he makes a joke that he has a rather large library of which he has written most of the books, since they're the copies of the Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. But that is the book that he is working on while he's at Walden. Basically is kind of an homage to his brother John, who had passed away a couple of years early from lockjaw. Bronson Alcott is born in actually Wolcott, Connecticut in 1799. He dies in Boston in 1888. He is one of his most noted things is he creates the Temple School in Boston. He is very much involved in education and a lot of kind of radical ideas for the day in education. And he actually engages Elizabeth Peabody, the famous Peabody sisters, and Margaret Fuller actually works at the Temple School in Boston for a while as well. He's one of the most frequent visitors to Thoreau. Thoreau actually mentions him in the book, not by name, but I think he calls him the philosopher. But he does talk about in Walden that he's getting these visits, and Alcott does actually visit Walden quite a bit. Thoreau's there. Friend and fellow activist Franklin Benjamin Sanborn said in his eulogy of Alcott, "Can you remember a single good cause, a single germinating idea in the last 60 years that did not find the embodiment in Mr. Alcott?" Interesting character, not the most pragmatic man in the world. And when we get to Fruitlands, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But obviously, the other thing is his daughter is Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. This is the Orchard House in Concord where she wrote the book. It's not where the book takes place, but it is where she wrote it. And over on the left side here, this is actually Alcott's philosophy school. So he has a school of philosophy. The building still stands today, that he ran for, I think, 10 years or so, right next to the Orchard House. You can see the house right here. And this is the actual Orchard House, which can be visited today. Interesting place to go. He wrote a famous book called General Maxims of Teaching, by which to relegate the instructor's practice in instruction. And, some of his ideas were, we kind of take it for granted now, but we talked at the beginning of, he wasn't into corporal punishment. Actually, Thoreau, when he graduates Harvard, he does become a school teacher in his early days, and he leaves school teaching because they want him to deliver corporal punishment, and he wants no part of that. So a lot of these things that are happening, and they are happening in Massachusetts, a lot of Horace Mann, a lot of the ideas around public education do generate from Massachusetts in the mid to late 1800s. So we certainly have that to thank as far as our public school system goes in the United States. And moving on to Margaret Fuller, this famous quote by Edgar Allan Poe, who is a contemporary of these and actually kind of verbally jousted with a lot of the Transcendentalists because he was a critic as well as an author. He says, "Humanity can be divided into three classes: men, women, and Margaret Fuller." So they famously had a couple of debates on various things. I think it was down in Baltimore. But her name was actually Sarah Margaret Fuller. Should have actually mentioned with Thoreau, his birth name was actually David Henry Thoreau. And he changed it for ideas that people don't really know to Henry David Thoreau, and was known that as the rest of his life. But you'll see that with a lot of these transcendentalists, the name that they use does change. So Margaret Fuller was, her birth name was Sarah Margaret Fuller, but she does go by Margaret Fuller. She was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1810. Actually, she was in Cambridgeport, part of Cambridge. And her father, he decides to retire from public life and ends up buying a farm in Groton, but he dies 2 years later. So the family is left to have to deal with this farm in Groton, and she goes to Boston to support herself. So she lives in Boston and actually ends up working at the Temple School. And this is kind of the theme with Bronson Alcott. She does work at the Temple School, but she's unpaid. And I think she tolerates that for a year or two, and then she has to go off and make a living. She does tutor and organize conversations for women, which rely on Greek myths, among other examples, to challenge the contemporary place of women in society. We'll get to that in a second. And she edits the first 2 years of the Dial, which is the publication that the Transcendentalists create. Once again, she does that unpaid. And her first book is a translation of Goethe called Conversations with Goethe in the Last Years of His Life while at her mother's farm in Groton, and is published in 1839. And they believe she was a model for Hawthorne's Hester Prynne, and she certainly is a model for Zenobia, main character in the Blythe-Wald romance, which we'll come to later, Hawthorne's book about the transcendentalist experimental community in West Roxbury called Brook Farm. So this is the Dial. As obviously graphics weren't a huge thing back in those days, but this is issue number 1, published in 1840. She does become the first foreign correspondent for a U.S. newspaper, not just the first female foreign correspondent. I believe she was actually the first foreign correspondent for the New York Tribune, who is edited by Horace Greeley. He's a very, very big proponent of really both Thoreau and Fuller. She actually goes over to one of the revolutions I mentioned, 1848, is happening in Rome. She goes to cover that, falls in love with one of the revolutionaries there, Giovanni Assoli, and they have a son, Angelo. Unfortunately, the revolution does not go their way, so they're forced to kind of scramble. And so she is going to bring the family back to the United States. And unfortunately, they perish in a shipwreck off Fire Island. And actually, Emerson then sends Thoreau down there to see what he can get, ideally recover the remains of Fuller, but he is not able to do that. He is able to get some of her belongings. I believe he ends up with actually the button off her husband's coat. But, and Thoreau talks about this in Cape Cod, his book, Going to the Cape. Before he gets to the Cape, he ends up in a shipwreck in either, I think, Scituate or Cohasset, and he's on the beach, and there's tons of shipwrecks happening on the New England coast in those days, and they become a real source for scavenging. So when these stuff washes ashore, including bodies, including cargo, everything else, the people go down to the beach and start really picking stuff apart. So when he gets down to Fire Island, he is not able to recover Fuller's remains. But we will get to where her memorial is. And about those conversations, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Peabody, who's one of her sisters ends up being Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, Sophia Peabody. She has a bookstore in downtown Boston, and it was right near where the current Brattle bookshop is, if you're familiar with that, on West Street, right by Downtown Crossing in Boston. And this plaque you can see right here, it's an indication these buildings are pretty old, and that's where they hold some of the conversations. And her bookshops were the first to offer foreign authors. She published The Dial there. And it was a meeting place for transcendentalists and intellectuals. So a whole host of characters here: Alcott, William Edley Channing, Theodore Parker we'll get to later on, and Margaret Fuller gives her lectures called Conversationists. And they were definitely a very, very important part of the early feminist movement. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is technically not a transcendentalist, but he is hanging out with this crowd in a big way. And like I said, he marries Elizabeth Peabody's sister, Sophia Peabody, and he lives in Concord, and of course he lives in Salem, but he lives in 2 different houses in Concord, which are very famous, and we'll get to those. But he is born in Salem in 1804, and actually dies on vacation in Plymouth, New Hampshire in 1864. He, keeping the theme here of these alterations of the name, he changes his name by adding a W to it. So rather than Hathorn, it becomes Hawthorne. And the reason for that is one of his ancestors was one of the judges during the Salem witch trial. So he wanted to distance himself from that. And I think the guy's nickname actually was the hanging judge. So he has that family legacy that he wants to distance himself from. So he adds a W to his name. He does go to Bowdoin, class of 1825, and his classmates are actually Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and the future president of the United States, Franklin Pierce, who he was on vacation with in Plymouth, New Hampshire when he died in 1864. He marries Sophia Peabody in 1842. And like I say, he's not a transcendentalist. If you're familiar with Hawthorne's work, he certainly has a less optimistic view of human nature, particularly when you think about things like the Scarlet Letter and the House of the Seven Gables. Speaking of which, the House of the Seven Gables is something you can visit up in Salem today. We went there this winter. And Sophia Peabody was actually an artist. And so some of her original works are in the House of the Seven Gables, and she was quite a good artist. And once again, a female artist in the mid 1800s is not something that's all that common. So she is a very, very accomplished artist, and they have two of her paintings at the House of the Seven Gables. And one of the famous attributes to the House of the Seven Gables is the hidden stairway. I had not been there in 50 plus years, but I remember the hidden stairway. So you can go up the hidden stairway. I didn't remember that, but the tour guide lets us go up the hidden stairway, which is very hidden and very narrow. The interesting thing about this stairway is the House of Seven Gables. There's this character, I guess, who kind of appears in different places, and I don't think it's articulated that there's a hidden staircase, but it's kind of implied. The interesting thing is this is actually put in after the novel was written. So the house is redone in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And actually, a lot of the Seven Gables had been removed. And so this Caroline Emerson, who's the owner of this at this point in time, we'll get to her in a second, she kind of retrofits it to make it, kind of, art mimicking history, mimicking art. And she has this hidden stairway installed. And she has the seven Gables. By the time Hawthorne was there, one of his cousins actually owned the house in the 1800s. And at that point, it did not have the original Seven Gables. It had been kind of rejiggered and I think it only had like 3 or 4 gables, but she put it back to the original Seven Gables. And speaking of which, we will do a little pano here of it's kind of quite a complex down in Salem on the water. They have the House of the Seven Gables. They have this courtyard, and there are various buildings related to the time frame in that. And they actually moved Hawthorne's birthplace, this red house here on the left, he was born in Salem, and the building was down the street, but they moved it to the location. And so now when you go to the House of the Seven Gables, you can actually go into Hawthorne's birthplace as well. It's a very nice complex. And it's interesting, and we'll get this story with the Margaret Fuller house as well. But as I mentioned, Caroline Emerson is this philanthropist who buys the house in the late 1800s, early 1900s, redoes it, puts in the staircase, but she makes it a settlement house for immigrants. So in the early 1900s, it becomes a settlement house for immigrants. And to this day, it still has that function as they offer classes. When we were there in, I guess it was January of this year, they were offering a lot of Ukrainian classes and things based on Ukrainian language to help any Ukrainian people who had immigrated to this country transition into living in the United States. So that whole concept of a settlement house is kind of interesting. That we'll see that with the Margaret Fuller house, that these houses, have had these functions for a while. Now, I mean, Hawthorne wasn't nearly into the social uh, progressive stuff that Fuller was, but it is kind of interesting that this house becomes a settlement house, and over 100 years later, it still is that. And the only house he actually owned is the Wayside, which is a couple of houses down from the Orchard House in Concord. And he owned that 1852 to 1870. He passes away, and Sophia keeps it. It is currently a national parks property. And full disclosure, I have started to volunteer for the National Park Service at the Minuteman Historical National Park. So this is not open all that often, I think due to staffing and other concerns. So I'm hoping I've never been in it. I've been outside, obviously, photographing it, but this third story section was added for Hawthorne, and so he wrote in here. But it is open. I believe it's open on weekends beginning mid-July, mid-June. through Columbus Day, but I'm not sure. So I do need to talk to my contact at the National Park Service to see what's going on there. And I'd love to volunteer and be able to work at that house. But working at the Old North Bridge is pretty cool as well. So if you happen to be floating around any of the visitor centers or the Old North Bridge, you may run into me. So this is Concord. This is actually the Minuteman Park is split into two. This is the Battle Road area where there's a visitor center with a 23-minute video on it. This is the Old North Bridge, where there's also a visitor center here with a shorter 7-minute video. The actual Old North Bridge is right here. And in between is just like a whole mess of history. So we had Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which is where a lot of these folks are buried in a famous place called Arthur's Ridge. You have the Wayside right here, Hawthorne's house. You have the Orchard House here. You go down here and you have Emerson's house and you have the Concord Museum. So this whole stretch of road is just an amazing, amazing amount of history. And then you have the old manse over here by the Old North Bridge. Part of the challenge is they're owned a lot by different entities. So there is not a one-stop shopping as far as ticketing goes. As I said, the National Park Service owns the Wayside, but the Orchard House is kind of its own thing. The Emerson House is its own thing. The Concord Museum is its own thing. Old Manse is owned by the Trustee of Reservations, but an incredibly interesting place to visit if you haven't. And if you have, it's an incredibly interesting place to go back to. So I think at this point, we will take a break and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, Bruce, a couple interesting things. We have someone who works at the Main Street Visitor Center on the call today, Abby, who has welcomed people to stop by and mentioned that the map you were showing she gives out there. So that's awesome. Welcome, Abby.
So Abby
Also,
probably knows my friend Victor, who works at the visitor center as well.
yeah, probably so. One of the questions that came up, and this was asked really early on, Bruce, so you may have already covered it, but I thought Margaret Fuller only had one child and he drowned along with Margaret and her possible husband when he was 3 in a shipwreck. How could she have a descendant? Am I remembering wrong? That's the first question. So did you mention that she had descendants early on?
Yes, yes. Well, I think the descendant comes from one of her siblings.
Okay,
But
great.
yes, she did have a son. I think he was actually 1 or 2 years old. But yes, unfortunately, he did perish in the shipwreck as well.
Okay, so that answers that. So someone in the family's child, not
Actually,
necessarily her
yes,
child.
actually, probably a brother, since the guy's last name was Fuller. So I would assume that was he's a descendant of Margaret Fuller's brother. Margaret Fuller's, I should know this, but one of her siblings was married to married to a Channing, but there was more connections within the Transcendentalists with the Fuller family.
Great. Also, we've had 1 or 2 people saying they're planning to visit Concord, and I know you're thrilled to hear that, to see some of the sites that you're talking about. Another question is, can Concord be seen all in one day? So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question because when I get to my Transcendentalist Ramble, I will show you, if you are dedicated, what you can do in one day. But as far as Concord specifically, I would say yes, it would be a busy day. The challenge is, I just found this out when I was down at the Old North Bridge yesterday, that the Old Manse right now is only open on Saturdays and Sundays and Monday holidays. So I don't know the other places. I know the Concord Museum is pretty much open every day. I don't know about the Emerson House, but the only thing I would say about seeing it in one day is everything open. But as far as going to it, I mean, that's just an amazing day. There's nice restaurants in Concord. You can definitely, particularly this time of year with the light staying late in the afternoon, early evening. Yeah, it's a full day, and your head will be full of history, but you can definitely do it.
Great. And Abby, also the one who works at the visitor center, mentioned that Margaret Fuller's sister Ellen was married to William Ellery Channing, went by Ellery, and was a friend of Thoreau's, and he's a nephew to the Unitarian minister. So lots of
Yes.
interesting things.
Yes. And I see somebody says, well, the Alcott daughter is transcendentalist. We'll get to that in a second. I have a little bit about Louisa May and her view on that.
Great. Okay, that's all the questions for now, Bruce.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so the Old Corner Bookstore, I mean, I just put this in there because I worked in downtown Boston for like 30 plus years, and I walked by this building every day and was disappointed it's a Chipotle. It used to be the Globe Corner Bookstore when I first worked in Boston in the mid 80s. But it's interesting in the fact that it is the oldest commercial building in Boston. So it's built in 1718. It's actually built on the site of Anne Hutchinson's house. So people familiar with Anne Hutchinson, she's one of the people who displeased the Puritans and was banished to Rhode Island. But the reason I bring it up in this context is it was the home of Ticknor and Fields, and they're a publishing house in the 1800s, and they're really at the center of publishing a lot of these folks. Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, James and Annie Fields are two of the people who are involved in this. Annie Fields, I did a presentation a while back about artistic New England. She ties into Sarah Orne Jewett up in Maine. She ties into Isabella Stewart Gardner. So really interesting nexus of a lot of the intellectual life of Boston and Massachusetts going on in the mid 1800s. And it actually ends up being a precursor to the publishing house of Houghton Mifflin. And so it was saved by demolition in 1960. And when I did my research for this presentation, it made me feel a bit better as to why it's a Chipotle, is because it's currently leased out, and that helps pay for preservation efforts in Boston. So I said I was disappointed when it went from the Globe Corner bookstore, which was an amazing bookshop of mostly travel books, I think, if I remember correctly, back in the 80s and 90s. See it as a Chipotle, not to slam anything against Chipotle per se, but part of the economics. And so the fact that we do have this building literally, like 400 years old, that's still there, is amazing. And to switch gears a little bit, you can't really talk about this situation in this era without kind of going down this hole. Tuberculosis, as we've seen already and we'll see later, ends up being a big issue with a lot of these folks. And so Thoreau himself, his sister Helen, Theodore Parker, and Emerson's first wife, as I mentioned, Ellen, all succumb to it. Mercury poisoning, which this one is even kind of crazier in certain ways. There's a thing called calomel, which is used to treat various diseases, and it's also used for teething until 1948. And it's got, I believe, it's arsenic in it. And so Sophia Peabody, who's Hawthorne's wife, she is very sickly throughout her whole life. She does actually outlive Hawthorne, but she's never in great health. And the supposition is her father was a dentist, and he used it for her teething in her very, very early childhood. Actually, may have contained lead. It contains some sort of contaminant, and particularly as a young child to have that, it was incredibly difficult for her with her development. So it actually affects Louisa May Alcott as well, because during the Civil War, she's a nurse for Civil War soldiers down south, and she has some unknown disease, and one of the doctors there treats her with this. And once again, for the rest of her life, basically, Louisa May Alcott is in poor health until she passes away. I believe she passed away in her 50s, but she is not in great health from her mid-20s onward. As I mentioned, Thoreau's brother, John, passes away from lockjaw. He actually cuts himself with he's actually sharpening his razor, rusted razor, I guess, cuts himself, ends up contracting lockjaw, and dying in Thoreau's arms a couple of weeks later. So, once again, we have tetanus boosters now and tetanus shots. So you kind of have a good appreciation of, some of the advancements we've made, and scarlet fever. And a really, really tragic time frame for the Transcendentalists is within a month of Thoreau's brother passing away, Emerson's first son, Waldo, passes away from scarlet fever. So it's in the winter time frame, January to February, I think 1843 maybe. So that really hits the Transcendentalist community really, really hard with both those deaths that happened so close together. And typhoid fever claims Hawthorne's daughter, Una, who is over in the UK, I believe, and I believe Sophia and Una were buried in the UK and were disinterred and brought back to Sleepy Hollow maybe about 10 years ago. So, and not to think this is something in the past, the best-selling author John Green, ironically enough, literally just released a book about a month ago called Everything is Tuberculosis, The History and Persistence of Our Deadliest Infection. So unfortunately, tuberculosis is still with us, and it does pop up every once in a while here in the United States, but certainly in other parts of the world, it is very, very pervasive. So this is Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, right kind of behind the square, Monument Square in downtown Concord. You can drive into the cemetery. It is the Author's Ridge is kind of back toward the rear of the cemetery. So if you're doing that 1 day trip into Concord, I would suggest that you maybe drive into the cemetery, save a little bit of time, and you can go up to the Author's Ridge, and Hawthorne's up there, Thoreau's up there, Emerson's up there. Pretty interesting place. And these are, the cemeteries are actually beautiful spots, very wooded, well tended. So with that, we'll go into the Transcendentalist Ramble. So what kind of got me down this path was, I've been interested in the Transcendentalists. They've existed in Concord, which is only about 15 minutes, well, 30 minutes from where I live, probably 10 miles. So I've been in the area a lot, and they kept coming up in different things I was doing, different readings, and I was like, well, I should go visit these places. So I decided to kind of issue myself a challenge of, some of these places are south of Boston, and those of you who are natives or residents around Boston realize, those of us north of Boston, traveling south of Boston is, you might as well be going to Tahiti. We don't really typically venture that far south. We have people who go north to the mountains and to Maine, and people who go south to the Cape. So I decided, like, if the winter's a good time, traffic's not horrible, let's have a challenge and go visit some of these sites. So the majority of these were done in a single day. And I'm up here in Chelmsford, but kind of swept down here to West Roxbury, and there's Brook Farm down here. This is the Theodore Parker Church in West Roxbury, Schoolmaster Hill in Franklin Park. I actually missed this one. I had to go back the following weekend, but that's the Margaret Fuller House in Cambridge, Mount Ormond Cemetery, and the Cambridge Watertown Line, and then out to Walden Pond. Old Manse and Fruitlands I've been to a zillion times. I did go back to the Old Manse actually at Christmas time. They had a very nice program there at Christmas time, but those were not concluded in the day. But it was a pretty robust day of going and visiting these sites. And I wouldn't say a lot of them aren't typically well visited, and we'll kind of get into that. And as I mentioned with Alcott, and actually George Ripley, there were a couple of transcendentalist communities that spawned from the movement in the 1840s, and there are some remnants of them still today. First one's Brook Farm, which, as I mentioned, is in West Roxbury, which is, I guess, officially part of Boston, but a little bit south of downtown. And this is what's left there. It was founded by George Ripley. It was a transcendentalist commune from 1841 to 1843. It was actually issued as a joint stock company. Our friend Nathaniel Hawthorne is a member. So, that's the whole thing about debate. Was he a transcendentalist? No, probably not. His work certainly weren't in that vein, but he was very much in the movement, and he was a resident of Brook Farm for 6 months. And I think he actually was a owner in the joint stock company and actually had to sue to get some money back. But it changes in 1847 or 1844 to 1847 to what's called the Fourierist phalanx, which is another utopian. There's this whole hotbed of utopian communities that are going on in the United States in the mid 1800s. The most notable one is probably the Shakers. I did do a presentation on the Shakers a while ago, where I went into some of the other communities, Oneida communities, and there's various ones that kind of pop up. And there's Ruskin, John Ruskin, the gentleman from England who was very influential. These things do kind of pop up all over the place. So this Brook Farm kind of goes from a transcendentalist one and goes to a Fourierist one, and eventually becomes a Lutheran property for 130 years. And then it's actually acquired by the state of Massachusetts and now managed by the Department of Conservation and Recreation in West Roxbury. The lone building remaining is not from Brook Farm. It's actually from the print shop from the Lutheran Martin Luther Orphanage. What the Transcendentalist Brook Farm was most noted for was its school. Like I said, education was very core to what was, going on with the Transcendentalists. So they had this school there that they would charge people to go to, and that became kind of the economic engine for that. Unfortunately, none of this stuff really exists anymore, but there is a property there. It is a park. It's actually kind of an entrance to a cemetery. If you go back in there, there's a cemetery. But there's actually pretty good walking trails. And there's some information about Margaret Fuller visited there, Thoreau visited there. So those folks were actually involved with that. Emerson was a bit skeptical, as he was of most things along this line. He does visit, I believe. He doesn't live there. But this is a note from Ripley to Emerson. Our objects, as you know, are to ensure a more natural union between intellectual and manual labor that now exists, to combine the thinker and the worker, as far as possible in the same individual, to guarantee the highest mental freedom by providing all with labor adapted to their tastes and talents. whose relations with each other would permit a more simple and wholesome life that can be had amidst the pressure of our competitive institutions. One of the more interesting things about some of this stuff you read from the Transcendentalists is how pertinent it is to today. Now, if you read that, this is 1840. I believe the Communist Manifesto comes out a couple of years later. And you see that particularly with the Shakers. Frederick Engel, who wrote the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx, actually comments on the Shakers and their communal life. So you have these things going on, and you see this thing about, the thinker and the worker, and is adapted to their tastes and talents. The whole thing about, each adapted to his needs. So you have a lot of these ideas bubbling around in this area, and it's pretty fascinating that this is all happening around here. This one I find, once again, not rife with humor here, but this one I find very funny. This is from Hawthorne to his, at the time, fiancee Sophia Peabody, and says, after breakfast, Mr. Ripley put a four-pronged instrument into my hands, which gave me to understand was called a pitchfork. And he and Mr. Farley, being armed with similar weapons, we all three commenced a gallant attack upon a heap of manure. I shall make an excellent husbandman. I feel the original Adam reviving within me. So, so he only lasted 6 months, but he was a very much of a cultured guy. Ends up working for the customs house in Salem. Manual labor was not his forte, but this is a pretty comical passage of his time at Brook Farm. So Margaret Fuller, there was a cottage there that burns down in 1984. They called it the Margaret Fuller Cottage because she did stay there a lot when she visited Brook Farm. I was wandering through the woods and I found this foundation near where the map told me the location of Margaret Fuller's cottage was. I assume if it was the foundation of Margaret Fuller's cottage, they would have said that, but it was pretty close. And like I said, there's kind of some rambles you can go through there. I mean, obviously I was there in the winter, so the trail was a little bit restricted, but it's a beautiful spot in West Roxbury. And the other community is Fruitlands Museum out in Harvard, Massachusetts. So for a little bit of geographic positioning here, Harvard is out to the west. We're off of 495 here, a few towns down from Groton. And it is the home to the Fruitlands Museum, which was established by Clara Endicott Sears. She's a preservationist from a wealthy Boston family. She actually does some legitimate research and writes a book called Gleanings from Shaker Journals. So the Shakers had a village in Harvard, Mass, right down the road from where the Fruitlands was. So once again, you had this really interesting kind of juxtaposition because some of the Fruitland members, at least one, ends up going to the Shakers when Fruitlands falls apart. The Alcotts, I think Bronson wanted to go to the Shakers and his wife finally stepped in, so that's not going to happen. But she does actually get some information journals from first primary source journals from the Shakers, and she has a book that she wrote about Bronson Alcott's Fruitlands because the farmhouse that was there was on the property, and she buys that. This is actually a Shaker house that she has moved to the property later, but it was a pretty interesting story. So Bronson Alcott and a gentleman from England, I believe Alcott met him when Alcott did a speaking tour in England, and this guy Charles Lane, they come up with this idea: we can live on this farm and we can do all these wonderful things and subsist on Mother Nature, but they don't want to use beasts of burden or manure. They don't start habitating there until June. I'm not an expert farmer, but if you're not planting your crops till June here in New England, that's probably not going to end well. So they don't make it through the winter. So the experiment, such as it was, only lasts for a few months, and they have to basically go with tail between their legs back to Cambridge or back to, I forget actually where Alcott ends up. He ends up back in Concord. Like I said, I believe Lane does end up with the Shakers for a bit. And the Shakers did have a whole thing where they had what they called winter Shakers, where people would go live with the Shakers in their village for the winter and then skedaddle when the weather got better. So that was not an unusual thing. But it was just really interesting having the Shaker village a couple of miles away and Fruitlands happening as well. And so this Fruitlands they have the Shaker building right there. They have a museum of Native Americans, and they also have a museum in the Hudson River School of Painting. So it is owned by the Trustee of Reservations, as is the Old Manse. So once again, a highly recommended place to go. And obviously in the fall, you have, I think it's on Prospect Mountain. You're looking over there to either Mount Wachusett and or Monadnock, but it's just a beautiful, beautiful spot. So it's always interesting to see things that are written at the time, the contemporary comments that are made. There was an article in this publication called The Newness, or the article titled The Newness in a publication called The Pioneer. Robert Carter says Alcott was very strict, rather despotic in his rule of the community, and some of the members have told me they were nearly starved to death there, and they absolutely would have perished with hunger if they had not furtively gone among the surrounding farmers and begged for food. One of the other stories is that he and Lane were out really having all kinds of philosophical discussions, where his wife Marmee in the Little Women is basically kind of making things work, like harvesting what little crops they have, getting apples, things along those lines. And Emerson's famous quote is, "I will not prejudge them successful. They look well in July. We will see them in December." And in December, January, they actually disbanded. He did see them because they were basically heading back to Concord. So, like I said, it's a beautiful spot. It is very steep on a hill. You kind of park, for the most part, up at the top of the hill where there's a nice cafe and a gift shop. This is the farmhouse, the Fruitlands, the Shaker Building. See how they're related. And you go down there, and over here, the Native American and Hudson River School um, museums. And now, this is part of the trustees. They do have different art exhibits. There's an art exhibit actually right now based on the Shakers that just opened up last week. So it's a really incredible place to go. And like I said, going back with the theme of nature and the Transcendentalists, this is really an amazing place to spend some time, particularly in the fall. Back about 20 years ago, they had a bunch of sculptures by the now deceased sculptor Joe Wheelwright, where he took trees and basically took the root ball here and used that as a head and then fashioned these into various beams throughout the woods. It was an amazing exhibit that I had the pleasure of actually having him be the tour guide for the exhibit. It was really cool. And this is my wife and daughter walking through the woods. They have amazing hiking trails throughout the area as well. So, somebody mentioned about, we're the Alcott children transcendentalists. So Louisa May Alcott does write a book, really a satire called Transcendental Wild Oats. And Hawthorne writes a book called The Blithedale Romance, which is based on his experiences at Brook Farm. And they're both kind of a jaundiced view, rightfully so, of what would happen to Brook Farm. But Louisa May Alcott definitely, she was a young girl when the whole thing happened. And I think she was 10 or 11 around that time. And so she kind of knew what was what to a certain degree. And she does write this novella later on in her life that is kind of skewers her father's experiments at Brook Farm. And Hawthorne's a little less harsh to a certain degree, but it's an interesting take. And of course, once again, he left that for 6 months. So continuing the ramble, we have the Margaret Fuller House, this is where she was born and grew up until her father decided to go to the wilds of Groton in those days, and this is in Cambridge. Once again, as with the House of the Seven Gables, this becomes a settlement house. And in 1902, and you can see the time frame with this and the House of the Seven Gables is very similar, early 1900s, lots of immigration happening. So obviously there's a need here. So both of these buildings become settlement houses, which I find kind of interesting, particularly in Fuller's case, since she was very much well ahead of her time, a lot of progressive ideas. And to this day, this is what this building is used for, child and family services, food services, elder services, and community advancement, all for the city of Cambridge. That's how it looked back when photography was young. Doesn't really look all that different today. Definitely could use a paint job, but they have put a mural here on the side, and it is a community location in Cambridge, near Central Square. And this is their website. And so integrated community services to help individuals overcome challenges. I think Margaret Fuller would be happy that is what it's being used for today. So they have a marker. Her family has a plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is in Cambridge. I know I mentioned that in previous presentations. Lots of famous people are buried there. It is a garden cemetery. I think it was one of, if not the first garden cemetery in the United States in the 1830s. So there is a marker to her. She did take the name solely. It's debatable as to whether she actually married the Count. I think there's no official wedding certificate as such, but she did take his name. And this is the family plot, and you can certainly see that today in Mount Auburn Cemetery. So we'll quickly go through Theodore Parker, who is another transcendentalist. He's born in Lexington and dies in Florence in 1850. Why is he in Florence? He has tuberculosis. So, the whole thing of trying to get better air, that was a lot of the, outside, was one of the real big therapies for tuberculosis. Some people did recover from it. Most did not. He graduates from Harvard Divinity School, actually can't go there in undergraduate because he has a lack of funds. He is a minister at the West Roxbury Unitarian Church for about 10 years in the 1830s and 1840s. He's one of the Secret Six, tying back to my friend John Brown. Actually, I should not call John Brown my friend, but tying back to John Brown. There were a bunch of people in Massachusetts, I think mostly, who were known as the Secret Six, who were kind of supporting him both financially and ideologically. Parker was not that rich, but he did promote a lot of John Brown's ideas. And some couple of famous quotes that have been reused by Theodore Parker. One is a government of all, by all, for all, which kind of gets co-opted by Abraham Lincoln for the Gettysburg Address. And this longer-winded one is, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eyes reach out but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And for what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. So you're very I'm sure most of you are familiar with that phrase, that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's attributed to MLK. This is the original. You can see why MLK is noted as a great orator. This is very wordy, but the concept is there, and MLK put it to a much more concise word. So his church is still there today in West Roxbury. It's called the Theodore Parker Unitarian Church, right on the main drag in West Roxbury, and there's a statue to him. So he actually, for those of us from Chelmsford, we have a book that we discuss, one book the whole town reads every year. It's sponsored by the Friends of the Library. They buy 500 copies for people in town to read. And the one we had last year was Master and Slave, Husband and Wife. And the author, Ilian Wu, actually came to speak last April, just a month ago. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And the main characters in the book are William and Ellen Craft, and they are escaped slaves. They're involved in the abolitionist movement. They're involved with Frederick Douglass. Theodore Parker actually performed the marriage ceremony for those two. So that's kind of a neat little tie-in there. Moving on to Schoolmaster Hill, which is in Franklin Park. Emerson lives here for a couple of years. He teaches in West Roxbury, which is known as Canterbury then. Actually leaves and ends up living in a farm in Chelmsford for a few months. He leaves this job to actually attend Harvard Divinity School. And it was on the location that today is Franklin Park, which was part of the Emerald Necklace, which Frederick Law Olmsted put together. Didn't complete it, but put it together. I'm actually working on a project on Olmsted as well. He pops up a lot. And it actually became later on the location for the superintendent's house of the park. And he wrote a poem about it. And there's a marker and this rather large rock there of where the house that Emerson lived while he was a teacher in the mid 1820s. And once again, it gets you to Franklin Park, which is this amazing gem in the Emerald Necklace, right in the downtown bar around Boston. And you'll see a picture here that this is the old superintendent's house. This is the only structure that's left. And looking through there, you can see this is a golf course, and in the winter it's used as a sledding hill. So it's this amazing expanse of open space within Boston. And the Emerald Necklace is a bunch of those. And the Old Manse, as I mentioned, the Old Manse is actually built by Emerson's grandfather in 1769. Hawthorne, when he gets married, he and Sophia rented from 1842 to 1845, and Thoreau's wedding present to them is a vegetable garden. He actually cultivates a vegetable garden for them. As I mentioned before, he's owned by the trustees. Right now it's open on Saturdays and Sundays and Monday holidays, so it'll be open for 3 days this weekend. I assume it'll be open more during the summer, but not positive. So the Old Manse is one of these really interesting structures in American history, because it's there built in 1869, 1769, and it is literally, I don't know, 100 yards or so from the old North Bridge. So, the shot heard around the world is literally happening within viewing distance of this. And so they do have a lot of reenactments there, and this was actually on April 17th, a few years back. We had the 250th anniversary a few weeks back, but this was done before COVID, so around 2019 or 2018. But they shot off cannons, and this is actually a photo of the house, kind of taken from the North Bridge. This is even a different one. But the interesting thing is this study over here, this window, overlooks the North Bridge. So they saw literally the start of the American Revolution. And it's the room that Emerson writes his essay Nature, which is kind of his kicking off the Transcendentalist movement. And Hawthorne, about 6 or 7 years later, writes a short story collection called Mosses from an Old Manse, which actually gives the name to the house. which I think is a French term for minister's house. So it's one of these really unique rooms in American history where like this stuff, it is the room where it happened, to kind of paraphrase Hamilton. And if you want to see the actual chair that Emerson wrote Nature in, that is at the Concord Museum. They have Thoreau's writing desk. They have one of the lanterns that was, you know, commanded by Paul Revere to hang in the Old North Church. Just an amazing repository of early American history. So we have Walden Pond, which Thoreau starts on July 4th, 1845, and departs September 6th, 1847, 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days on the shores of Walden Pond. This is actually the illustration of the first edition of Walden Pond, with this illustration done by one of his sisters. Published in 1854. And my slides are going a bit wonky. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived. So this is actually the dimensions blueprint, as it were, of the cottage. It was 10 by 15 of the cabin. And this is the list of materials. He builds the whole thing for $28.13, which in today's dollars is about $2,800. So he is the progenitor of the little house movement that we have going on here, but he uses a lot of repurposing secondhand, using old bricks, refuge, shingles, and sides. Really a man way ahead of his time. So before I jump into kind of the end of this, let's take if we have any more questions, Lisa.
I don't see any. Does anyone have any questions they want to type in, and we can Bruce can get them at the end. So yeah, I think we're good for now.
All right. So one of the benefits of getting older, there are a few, but there are a couple, is in the state of Massachusetts, you can get for $10 a pass for the Department of Conservation and Recreation for most of their properties. And they run Walden Pond. So last fall, I used that as an impetus to say, okay, I'm going to go and photograph Walden Pond for a year. Probably do it longer, but I'll do it. So I started in September. Still doing it today. It does cost $8 a day. If you're out of state, it's $30. So I've been to Walden Pond a dozen or so times, and I also volunteer for the Chelmsford Telemedia here in town, which is a telemedia station that has access to all kinds of cool audio-visual equipment. So it morphed into not just a photographic kind of experiment, but also a video experiment. So over the course of the last few months, I put together this 2-minute and 19-second video, which is kind of my homage to Thoreau. So I'll say a couple of things about that video. One is Thoreau did live in Chelmsford for actually about 2 years, very young, from about 2 to 4 years old. So I did show a house called the Fisk House, and it's very unclear where he lived in Chelmsford. He mentions in his journal a few times. I mean, he writes in the 1850s, I think, of the entries in his journal. Some houses have moved, but he actually did. There's no doubt he lived in Chelmsford for 2 years, so we can claim some ownership of Thoreau. And the other thing I will say is that a video of the ice fisherman, it was a really interesting experience because the things around here don't freeze that much anymore in the winter. I grew up in upstate New York, grew up playing ice hockey as a kid on natural ponds that happen pretty much every winter. It's a rare occurrence around here now, but this winter we had a relatively cold winter, at least compared to recent standards, and so it froze over about I think 7 or 8 inches thick at Walden Pond, and there were a lot of ice fishermen out. And I said it was just a really cool experience to be right in the middle of Walden Pond, standing on the ice, and just looking all around. That was I'm glad I was able to experience that. But so if you, it is, I will say, back to the question about can you do Concord in a day? It is a long day, and you could make arguments. You could probably spend the whole day just at Walden, but it is a pretty cool place. So, as I mentioned, lots of quotes from these folks. Rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. I don't know whether John Lennon co-opted that for his song, but if you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. Books are a treasured wealth of the world and the fit inheritance of generations and nations. Appropriate since we're being sponsored by a library tonight. I love this is my favorite one. Live in each season as it passes. Breathe the air, drink the drink, taste the fruit, and resign yourself to the influences of the earth. That's what I'm trying to do in my year-long kind of photo escapade, video escapade in Walden Pond, is really appreciate each season as it comes along. Certainly here in New England, for better or for worse, we have four very, very distinct seasons. Another famous one, the massive men lead lives of quiet desperation, and our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify, simplify, simplify. So once again, he is pretty pertinent. This is just a quick one. Modernization was really encroaching upon the world. Industrialization is beginning to kick off in full steam in the 1840s and 1850s. And the railroad goes right by Walden Pond, literally. And so he makes comments about it's a passenger train to Fitchburg. And so he makes comments when he's living in the cabin at Walden. When I hear the iron horse make the hills echo with his snort like thunder, shaking the earth with his feet and breathing fire and smoke from his nostrils, the train track does go at the far end of the pond. When you come to the pond where the parking lot is actually they're rebuilding the bathhouse down by the beach, but all the way across is where the train track is. And I was walking through there and I just stopped. That is in no way amplified. I mean, they're diesel trains today as opposed to coal and steam trains from 200 years ago, but you still have that intrusive noise to this day, and there still is the commuter rail going from Boston to Fitchburg. So another quote, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. It is not important that he should mature as soon as an apple tree or an oak, should he turn his spring into summer. So we'll wrap up here. This is the eulogy that Emerson gives at Thoreau's funeral. The country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost. It seems an injury that he should leave in the midst his broken task, which none else can finish, a kind of indignity to so noble a soul, that it should depart out of nature before yet he has been really shown to his peers for what he is. But he at least is content. His soul was made for the noblest society. He had a short life, exhausted the capabilities of this world. Wherever there is knowledge, wherever there is virtue, wherever there is beauty, he will find a home. Now, I will say, when Emerson gives a lecture, or whatever, these things are very long. I believe his eulogy was, I think it might have been like, I don't know if it was 2 hours is right, but it was long. But this is end, and it's an incredibly, incredibly touching words. For he and Thoreau had a fractured relationship, and kind of went in and out. And toward the end, they seem to have reconciled. And so this is an amazing, amazing tribute to his friend. So legacy, this is actually at the Decordovi Museum, which is about 2 miles from Walden Pond. It's a sculpture park called Huff and Puff by Hugh Hayden. It'll be on view there until 2033. He takes the Walden cabin, Thoreau's cabin, and puts it at an angle. It's a very disquieting view. Really interesting piece of work. Friedrich Nietzsche fervently read Emerson as a 17-year-old. Obviously, the abolition movement owes a lot to them. Women's rights, that takes a long time. The 19th Amendment, giving the women the right to vote, does not come until 1920. It's 80 years after a lot of the suffragette movement happened. Education, I mentioned, a lot of current educational theory can trace itself back to the Transcendentalists and guys like Alcott. And Thoreau himself. I mean, nonviolence, certainly Gandhi and MLK reference him. A famous essay called Resistance to Civil Government, which later gets termed civil disobedience. And today's environmental movement, he's certainly one of the progenitors of that. And one of the famous books that really kind of encapsulates that is The Environmental Imagination, written in 1996 by Lawrence Buell. And there is no shortage of resources, a whole mess. And there's far beyond this. I'll just highlight a couple. A fiction and nonfiction. The nonfiction is a biography published relatively recently by Laura Dassel Walls called Henry David Thoreau, A Life, and a novel called Woodsburner, written in 2009 by John Pipkin. This takes a episode in Thoreau's life where he and a friend of his, I believe it was Edward Hoare, inadvertently start a fire in the forest near Concord. And so he's actually kind of, people would whisper behind him Woodsburner when he walked by. So he was kind of considered a bit of an outcast for that particular episode because a fire in those days is a huge deal, as it is today. But then you're not only building the structure, you're not only burning the structures, but you're burning the fuel. Because basically how houses are heated in Walden Pond, the actual space that Emerson gives Thoreau to spend time there, is a woodlot. So it's being managed as a source for fuel. So this book is really interesting because it takes that particular episode and weaves in different stories about it's in the late 1830s and 1840s. It gives you a really good sense of what the community's like in that time frame. So I highly recommend that. So with that, I am on Instagram. I'm not on an Icelandic course. I am on Instagram at bmagphoto. I have a public Facebook page of Bruce J. Magnuson Photography and a web page of brucemagnusonsmugmug.com. And I'll be more than happy to take any other questions.
Yeah, we do have a few questions, Bruce. A few slides back, someone asked, what was the hair used for?
Yeah, I think it was in the plaster.
Okay, good.
I know I saw that myself. I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the plaster.
Another question is, was George Ripley a different person from the Ripley's Believe It or Not?
Yes.
Different person.
Yep.
Okay. Was there any overlap with the Quakers?
Quakers. I don't know of a. I'm not familiar with the Quaker. There are Quaker meeting houses. I know there's one up in Exeter, New Hampshire, which is very old, one of the oldest buildings in Exeter, New Hampshire. I had to photograph it for a different project, but Um, it's an interesting question. I'm sure there must have been because, they're nonviolent, very much intellectual, but I can't recall of any direct relation. The Shakers were quasi-derived from the Quakers back in the UK, but I don't know of any direct interactions. Doesn't mean there weren't any.
Great, thanks. Someone asked, you had mentioned the pass, where you get that and what places you can visit. So that's the Massachusetts State Park parking pass, is that right?
Yeah, and you can go to the website, DCR's, I think it's dcr.org or dcr.ma.org, but it is pretty much any state park in Massachusetts that charges a fee except for Quabbin, and there might have been another one. I was kind of surprised if they were going to make exceptions. They didn't accept Walden Pond because I've been to Walden Pond now in all kinds of weather. Haven't been there in the summer, so I know it's crowded in the summer. But I will say there's very few times I've been there where I've certainly been alone. I was one wicked cold day this winter I was alone, but there's always people there. But it does include that. But it includes most state parks. We went to what was that place we went to in
Purgatory Falls?
Pur Purgatory Chasm.
Chasm, right.
Purgatory Chasm down in Sutton. We went there in the fall. Had a parking fee, and it works there. So it's
And
10
you have to
bucks.
be a Mass resident, Bruce? Do you know?
You have to be a
Okay,
Mass resident, and you have to
great.
be over 62.
Great, thank you. Just a comment that the quote about the legacy of the libraries and knowledge for nations is so pertinent today, given the
Yes, it
axe
is.
cuts to libraries and universities. And We all agree with that. Let's see. I'm just scanning to see if there's any other questions. A lot of accolades. We really appreciate it. It's so great to see people from so many different states, not only local, but, I saw people from New Jersey and Maryland and, all kinds of places. So thank you all so much for coming. It's great. We've had so many questions. Still looking to see if there's any other ones. I think that's about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for attending. Like I said, I hope to have some more coming this fall. I'm percolating some things around John Brown, Frederick Olmsted, might do something on Quebec. And I appreciate people's attendance, sharing this dreary, cold nor'easter day here in New England, and hopefully gave you some interesting ideas of places you might want to visit and some other interesting things to check out as far as literature and knowledge goes. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you for coming.